I'm Helen Sampson, and I'm the Director of the Seafarers International Research Centre at Cardiff University. In 2017, we began work on an Economic and Social Research Council funded study of the faith and related needs of multinational seafarers working on board cargo ships and of port-based chaplaincy. In this film, we describe some of the findings from that research, and we highlight both what the research team and what wider stakeholders have found to be of particular significance.
The research involved fieldwork on board 2 cargo vessels carrying multinational crews and 6 months spent in 2 different UK port locations.
As a declaration of faith is not required from seafarers prior to a voyage, we were unable to select vessels according to the faiths of the crews on board. Across the international cargo sector, Filipino seafarers predominate, and Chinese seafarers also make up a considerable proportion of the global workforce.
Our crews included 43 Filipino seafarers, 37 of whom were Roman Catholics. The remaining personnel came from China, Sweden, Norway, Latvia, the USA, and Sri Lanka. Among them were atheists, Lutherans, Buddhists, and Jehovah's Witnesses, alongside members of Potter's House, Jesus Lord, Iglesia Filipina, and Baptist congregations.
We did not record all the nationalities of the seafarers who we met in the seafarers' centres of the ports where the fieldwork took place, nor those who we encountered in the course of ship visits with chaplains and volunteers. However, there were significant numbers of Filipino, Chinese, Indian and East European seafarers in the mix, which tallies with the overall composition of the global seafarers' labour market. It's well established in the literature that people who work in very difficult circumstances often draw on their faith for support and for comfort and to help them deal with stressful situations. Seafarers actually work in really difficult conditions that are both physically challenging and psychologically challenging. So it wasn't really that surprising to find that seafarers often did draw on their faith and their God to help them cope with their working lives on board.
What's very interesting about the way they construct their beliefs is that it's very functional. So they're not concerned with what might be thought of as philosophical questions about does God exist. Rather, they're concerned with how can God help them as seafarers. There are a variety of ways in which they try and ensure that God will protect them. They'll have prayer cards which they carry in their wallets or have in their cabins. They might have rosaries. We had an example of a seafarer with a tattoo of a rosary on his arm. They might also sign themselves with the sign of the cross at the beginning of a shift or at a meal time. In more dramatic circumstances, they will call on God to protect them.
Seafaring is an extremely dangerous occupation, relatively speaking, and we found a lot of seafarers had experience of being very afraid on board ship at some point in their career. When they'd felt particularly hopeless, many had turned to their gods for assistance. However, when they were able to positively help themselves and their colleagues, many hadn't thought about God at all, but had only focused on dealing with the situation at hand. That idea of calling on your God when you feel helpless, but not in other circumstances when you can do something to help yourself, was something that I wasn't expecting.
I think the interesting thing with the research is the way it's dug into sort of seafarers' personal religious beliefs and how, a bit like politics on board ship, often it's off limits for discussion. You know, it's not something that is an easy discussion topic at sea.
There's a really strong occupational culture on board which puts strong priority on work, and that's the thing that all seafarers have in common. They recognise how important it is to avoid conflict on board, to avoid being sent home for getting into fights or getting into trouble, and to make their time on board run as smoothly from a work point of view as possible. In order to do that, they avoid talking about certain topics, anything that's controversial really, so politics would be one that they would avoid, and religion is another.
On the whole, they restricted the amount they would talk about religion or engage in religious controversy in public spaces, and often it was their private space, their cabin, which is where they would demonstrate their religious belief. The seafarers spend a number of months, 9 months, 8 to 9 months a year, away from home on board ship, and they understand their work as being very sacrificial in quite a Christian type way. They also believe that they are entitled to some reward, and so this can entail spending money on themselves in port, socialising, eating, drinking, and also the traditional thing that seafarers do of visiting sex workers. And this is not something which they see contradicts their Christian faith or is a problem theologically, because of this notion that there is some sense in which they deserve a reward for the sacrifice they're making.
They felt released in some way from observing some of the practices that would indicate piety ashore. They allowed themselves some freedoms which they felt their God would understand and forgive, because after all, on board ship they are sacrificing an awful lot to make a financial living for their families, and they felt that their God would often understand the conditions they were living in and make allowances, if you like. So some things that seafarers told us that they did on board that they wouldn't do at home involved drinking alcohol, involved eating meat on certain days or particular kinds of meat that they wouldn't normally eat at home, and involved commercial sex with sex workers in ports when the opportunity arose.
The most important finding from a theological point of view is the ability of the seafarers and their willingness to construct their own theology. So they put together their own set of beliefs. So they'll take from a variety of different sources, various practices, various rituals, and combine them in a very individual manner to establish a belief pattern. So what's interesting about groups of sailors like the Filipino sailors is that they would combine what we would consider more orthodox Christian beliefs with perhaps more popular beliefs from their indigenous religion or culture.
For example, our Filipino participants sometimes combined a belief in Orthodox Christianity with a belief in witchcraft or in the indigenous notion of aswang. The shipping industry employs an estimated 1.6 million seafarers from across the globe. Many of them are hired on precarious per voyage contracts, which can require them to be on board for up to 12 months.
In the cargo sector, seafarers may work on vessels which infrequently berth at a port. Oil tankers, for example, may load and discharge cargoes at sea rather than from shoreside terminals. This self-evidently curtails opportunities for shore leave.
Even when vessels are alongside in port, it may be difficult for seafarers to enjoy shore leave. Their work schedules may prevent it. They may be denied permission by the local immigration authorities, or they may find themselves in very isolated locations away from settlements and facilities.
Even when seafarers can get ashore, they're faced with challenges. They're unlikely to have local currency. They're likely to be unfamiliar with the local landscape. They may not speak the local language, and they may lack information about nearby facilities and services.
In this context, the provision of seafarer centers staffed with friendly volunteers and chaplains gains particular significance. Seafaring is a very difficult job, and when seafarers come to a port for a visit, they come to a foreign country, they don't know anyone, and they need help.
Seafarers centres come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, but one thing that I think a lot of the seafarers that we interviewed felt about them was that seafarers centres offer seafarers a safe space to go to when they're in a strange country.
The value of seafarers centres is almost immeasurable. I've seen it here locally with the Port of Bristol Seafarers Centre. Again, because of the changes in the industry in recent decades, the intensity of operations, the Seafarers Centre just provides almost like a little bit of punctuation in the seafarers' lives where they can just grab a bit of almost like normal life.
Port chaplains are people that you can talk to when you've been on a ship for a long time with the same set of people. They are people who will come on board and ask you how you are, maybe help you with phone cards and other things. And in ports where there's a seafarers center or a seaman center, there are often people in those places that you meet when you have a few hours to stretch your legs and get off your ship.
I think the most interesting point for me is the multifaceted role that people who work in seafarer centers and port chaplains perform. They could be a shopper, they could be a confidant, they could be a friend to seafarers, they could be religious figures. So they perform a lot of things.
One particular chaplain said to us, we had a ship coming into a port and we already knew that one of the seafarers on board was missing. And so we went on board the ship and it was like, wow, if the chaplains hadn't been there, nobody would have been there for these guys who are feeling this hurt, this loss, this confusion. So it was a special moment to be there to support, because these guys, they were processing. They just wanted to talk, you know. I don't know that we really helped them solve anything, but it was just the fact that they had somebody to vent to. They had a listening ear. They had someone who was open because they were going through a lot.
In the UK as well as in the US, the majority of port chaplains are Christians, come from Christian backgrounds. Yet over time, they've shifted from really primarily serving Christian seafarers to serving seafarers from a range of backgrounds and seeing their work as much more social service oriented.
When seafarers come to ports, they are not Roman Catholics, they are not Baptists, they are not Muslims, they are human beings, they are seafarers. And the people who work in seafarer centers, they welcome them with open arms. They welcome everyone, regardless of religion, regardless of skin color. And if you need support when it comes to your religion, they will be provided to you. If you want to go to a mosque, if you are sick and you want to go to a temple, and if there is one in the city or in town, then definitely people who work in seafarer centers, they will help you out.
It's very clear that port chaplains are working with a really multicultural, multilinguistic, multi-faith community in a way that's not typical of any other sector of chaplaincy.
In the port-based fieldwork, one thing that came across really strongly was the lengths to which port chaplains go to help seafarers.
It's physically exhausting, and I experienced that firsthand. And then, of course, you do it in adverse weather conditions. It could be raining hard, it could be drenched to the teeth.
So the amount of effort they go to help seafarers is extraordinary. But the thing that really struck me was the emotional labour that was involved. So it isn't necessarily the case that seafarers on board every ship will welcome port chaplains on board. Sometimes at the gangway, the seafarer is under instruction from the captain not to allow a port chaplain on board. I think it's a real credit to port chaplains and their faith, the strength of their faith, the way in which they simply pick themselves up, dust themselves off and get back out there again to support and help seafarers of all different faiths and all different nationalities, regardless of the circumstances. That degree of emotional labour is something which took me slightly by surprise in relation to the research. Obviously, it's something you kind of expect of a chaplain, but the extent to which they were able to actually deliver on what they believed was the right thing to do and the right way to behave was quite remarkable.
But sometimes seafarers would be sharing some sad stories. For instance, they weren't able to attend the funeral of a loved one, or they weren't able to attend a milestone in their children's lives, graduation, birthday party, and all those stuff. And when you listen to them, you share their sadness, their grief. And people who work in centers, they do it on an everyday, daily basis. But the thing is, the amount of emotional work that they do is quite revealing of the, in a way, superhuman effort that many of those who work in centers, port chaplains, perform.
One of our chaplains described their work as a ministry of presence. And sometimes they can't necessarily sense the immediate benefit of their visit. It may be that the benefit comes much later on and they may not even know about it. So I think they have to be quite patient and they have to be prepared for quite a lot of monotony on their job. So, they tend to have the same kinds of conversations, the same kind of routines of boarding the ship, trying to find people to talk to, finding out what their needs are. And they're kind of doing this day in, day out, and at some considerable cost to themselves. And we heard quite a lot of accounts of port chaplains having to do an awful lot of fundraising in order to do what they do. So, several chaplains said that they spent at least half their time just on fundraising.
I think that perhaps that way in which chaplains are being taken away from the work for which they have a real calling to become fundraisers was the most shocking thing that I came across in the course of the whole study.
I think the challenge of seafarer welfare is that it seems to be left to the voluntary sector and the religious organisations, and it shouldn't be. I think it's everybody's business.
The hopes that the Maritime Labour Convention would deliver more by way of seafarer welfare funding and assured seafarer welfare funding hasn't really materialised since the convention came into effect. Again, I think there's a feeling that we almost need to be moving to, again, what was recommended in 1943, compulsory levies. It's got to the stage at which we need to make that quantum shift forward in terms of funding systems and funding delivery, so that we have a guaranteed mechanism by which seafarer centres can be assured of their future.
I joined the mission 5 years ago. I was really quite surprised to see that the voluntary sector and community organisations are providing welfare and the state doesn't provide any support for that at all. The bodies that have grants and legacies, but I don't think that means that the state shouldn't get involved in maritime welfare, particularly with the emphasis given by the Maritime Labour Convention. The government's not going to do everything, but the government could do some things.
One of the benefits of working in a team and with a range of different stakeholders who have varying perspectives is that so much valuable information can be extracted from a single study.
We end this film with some reflections on how the data are significant to us and our organisations. In doing so, we indicate a range of future applications and uses for the overall project findings.
In the maritime welfare sector, we do spend quite a lot of time debating the value of centres, because centres are not being used as much as they were 20 years ago. So I think that hearing the voice of the seafarers come out and strongly in support of the port chaplains and all the work around that was very important. One of the key things that was interesting was the need for them to have written material, Bibles or prayer cards or rosaries, things like that, because those are things that we can produce in the mission and some of the other societies can produce also. One of the other interesting points was about the chaplains going on board at a time that is convenient for the seafarers. So we might go on board when they're busy. So there's something there about us knowing or finding out from the ship when is the best time to visit. And I think the challenge there will be that it might not fit into our hours. What is also important was chaplains trying to explain to the seafarers why they were on board. Because in that research, some of the seafarers weren't too sure who's the chaplain and what's the connection. So I think we can't assume that they know why we are there, that we need to say this is who we are. And then another interesting point was the fact that some seafarers felt that there wasn't any information for non-religious seafarers, for seafarers who don't have any faith. And I think that there is information, but it's about us making it more available.
A very interesting point, I think, for chaplains is to understand that seafarers are themselves theological agents. They produce their own set of beliefs. So whereas I was expecting that perhaps chaplains took Christianity to the seafarers and the seafarers were in many ways passive recipients of that, instead what we found was that the seafarers produced their own beliefs, and therefore chaplains would find themselves in negotiation with seafarers rather than just, if you like, preaching to them.
One of the other issues that I thought was important, that whole question of being out of sight and being in a very hard environment, can sometimes lead to risk-taking. So seafarers might do things that they don't normally do, like drink alcohol or seek commercial sex. And the fact that some seafarers will seek out commercial sex for intimacy or comfort, and the risk that goes with that. For the mission, that presents a challenge. We have a centre up in the north of the country that actually partnered with the Terence Higgins Trust to provide free condoms. But that then sparks a huge debate about, is that the place of the mission? And I'm very pleased that my staff just decided to do it and see what would happen. Is that something we could do globally? I'm not too sure because of cultural differences. But I think the issue of sexual health and risk-taking, alcohol, those are issues that we need to think about how to address. So that was important for us as well.
I do think it's very interesting to think about the perspective of women seafarers in relation to this issue that was raised in the research of seafarers' centres as safe havens for visiting seafarers. I think women in that context may have very particular needs, and it's worth thinking about whether or not they do, and if they do, whether or not they're being addressed at the present time.
The research was excellent because it's giving us a new knowledge and a new appreciation for our work, but also alerting us to some of the issues. You know, we believe in our work, but this is, I think, some kind of external validation. So I did speak to my staff at a meeting and told them that this research is emerging and these are some of the findings. So the findings around timing your visits and engaging with the seafarers so that they know why you're there, that's quite central to our work. I will share the research with our centres and our staff around the world. But one of the things that I will do is highlight key issues. I think I'll probably do a digest because people don't like to read long documents. But key things for them to note and think about so the staff will then implement those things in their work.
For me, the most interesting thing about this research was the chance to learn from the perspective of seafarers from many different countries about what their experiences are with port chaplains. It's actually something that's never been researched or asked, and I think it's information that will really help the port chaplains do better work, and hopefully even the shipping companies understand the importance of the kind of social support that port chaplains offer.
In highlighting the importance in providing services to seafarers, we are also highlighting the fact that they need our support, and people who are supporting seafarers need our support.
This research is critically important because it comes at such a almost like a watershed moment in seafarer welfare. Over the last few years, we've seen the seafarers' welfare needs change in very pronounced terms. I think there's been a much greater awareness of psychological needs as the industry's changed. The complexity of needs has changed dramatically, and so this research, for so many reasons, is so important in terms of sort of tapping into those changes, the need for the restructuring of services, and the need for a much more sort of fundamental reappraisal of what seafarers need and how it's delivered. And I think by tapping into the seafarers themselves, asking the questions of seafarers about their perceptions of what's important, what matters to them, you have the basis here for something that really could help deliver that quantum shift. And I think for all those reasons, it really should be welcomed and embraced and hopefully acted upon.
With regards to the funding question, I'm also on the council of the Merchant Navy Welfare Board. And the Merchant Navy Welfare Board is the national board for seafarers in the UK. And I think that there is a good question there for us in the Merchant Navy Welfare Board about how we work with government and how we work with industry.
It's interesting that in this research, at a time when many employers in other workplaces are thinking about how to make better accommodation for religious diversity, in this research, when talking to seafarers at the operational level, who have been allowed to work out their own ways of dealing with religious diversity, that they actually choose to keep religion very private. It's a topic that they don't choose to air publicly.
Well, I think what we've discovered is a form of popular theology. And the notion of popular theology is it's constructed by ordinary people rather than given to ordinary people by religious professionals like clergy or academic theologians. And I think what's true of what we found in the Seafarers, it's going to be true of Western society as well. That many people in Western society outside of the established churches will be constructing their own theologies, building it from a variety of sources, but making it coherent for themselves.
We hope that you've found this account of our research and its significance of interest. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who's contributed to the film, as well as our research participants and the Economic and Social Research Council, which supported the study and its dissemination.